This is the first substantive lecture. We start with chapter 1 and deal with the questions. The first question is, how does the government impact the average citizen? And there are a number of things in the book, and there's a couple of things that come from me. Let me start out with what's in the book. The government can impact the average citizen by sending citizens off to fight wars. That used to be a lot more important in the days when you had the draft and conscription, and people had to be drafted and you had to go. Now, with an all-volunteer army and a privatization of the army, there's a lot less of that, but still the people who go are subject to the problems that are associated with being citizens who are asked to make the contribution. So that's a problem, especially when you come back with all kinds of psychological and physical wounds, and you're only 19 or 20 or 21 or whatever the age of a fighting soldier is. The second thing is regulation of business, and the book talks a little bit about this kind of thing, that every kind of business in the United States is regulated. So if you buy some kind of food in the supermarket, whether it's fresh produce or it's something that's packaged, it's been subject to some kind of government regulation, which is aimed at making sure that the food is safe, or making sure that it's not containing salmonella or other kinds of things that you oftentimes see in products which come from animals. The third is the laws we must obey. There are all kinds of laws out there. All you got to do is think about what kind of laws affect you as a student, as a person walking around the United States. One of the basic ones, that's obvious ones, is traffic. We all are forced to get a driver's license, to make sure we have insurance, and to obey the traffic laws when we're driving. So that's one of the most obvious things, but there are all kinds of other laws we have to obey. The most obvious one, another obvious one, would be the next thing listed here, and that's taxes. Everybody has to pay taxes. Even if you don't work, you pay sales tax on just about everything you buy. Like, I live here in New Mexico, and you don't pay a lot of property tax, and you pay a limited amount of income tax, but you certainly pay a lot of sales tax. So everybody's being hit by that, and so it's things you have to go by, laws you have to obey. Another good example of that kind of thing would be going to the airport. Whenever we fly, we have to obey the laws that have been set down after 9/11 about not carrying certain things in our suitcases, not having water and other things when we're in our carry-ons, and subjecting ourselves to the government inspecting our goods, or whatever we're carrying on the plane, and even our person. And we give into that, even though the laws in the past outside the airport say that the government has to have probable cause before they invade our privacy. But privacy pretty much gone out the window, and I'm sure, I don't want to go into it here, but there's a lot of other examples I'm sure you can think of yourself, that laws you have to obey. The next one is benefits for some segments of the population. Certain groups of people in a society, I happen to be one of them now, older people, for example, people who are on welfare, people who are poor, people who don't have housing, and a lot of rich people too, that we don't often think of as benefiting segments of the population. Like, for example, farmers. Farmers get all kinds of benefits for growing food and not growing food, and growing food in a certain way, growing certain crops. All of those kinds of things are subjected to benefits that come to the farmers. There's also the notion, and this came from me rather than from the book, is cut and threaten benefits. So somebody who's getting benefits like Social Security to people who are older or people who are disabled, there's oftentimes threats, not just the cuts that eventually come, but the threat that there'll be benefit cuts. And that also affects how people think about government and what government's doing. Another thing that's not in the book, but was another idea that I had, was government licenses. Nowadays, all kinds of people need to get licenses from the government. We used to think of licensing whenever you thought about the government licensing, you thought of maybe something like license to hunt or something along those lines that would affect the average citizen. But nowadays, almost all kinds of occupations, not just professional people like doctors and lawyers, but all kinds of other people too, even mechanics and people who do your nails and all that kind of stuff, are subjected to getting government licenses. And then the last point that I would make here is about well-being, that the government affects our well-being, not only our physical well-being in terms of things like whether or not we can afford medical care or dental care or whatever kinds of care we need, even though we're supposed to be a individualistic society and we think of ourselves as paying for all these things ourselves, but in fact the government is subsidizing this in some way. So our physical well-being, especially if you think about the people I just mentioned, the segments of the population that benefit from government handouts, those people, their physical well-being is obviously affected if there's a cut in how much welfare money you're getting, or how much housing money you're getting, or how much Medicaid benefit you're getting. All of those things affect your physical well-being. Social Security is the same way. Most people on Social Security are living on a very limited fixed income, and so their physical well-being, whether they can afford to eat and all of that, is dependent on how generous the government wants to be with regard to the programs that affect them. And then there's another thing, and this is all coming from me, you won't see it in the book, is psychological well-being. How do you feel psychologically about what the government's doing? For example, it bothers me a great deal. It affects my psychological well-being that the United States now is in all these wars against virtually unknown enemies. So whether it's Al-Qaeda or ISIS or whoever it's going to be next week, the situation is, ever since 9/11, is that we're going into these wars with private groups or small groups of people that are not governments as we used to conduct wars in the past. And then our conduct in those wars can affect your psychological well-being. For example, for me, it is abhorrent that the United States would engage in torture. But so after I see something like what the United States was doing in Iraq at the Abu Ghraib prison, or what it did in Guantanamo to people who were captured by the United States as possible terrorists, that bothered me a great deal, and it still does. You know, the United States never, ever, in its whole existence, ever acknowledged in an official capacity that we would ever torture people. But now we're doing it, and it becomes official policy. Even if you go back to George Washington, when he was fighting against the Brits, made sure that his soldiers did not torture the British soldiers who were captured. And that has been the policy all the way up until 9/11, and then after 9/11, we began to torture people. And that can bother you. It certainly bothers me. As a matter of fact, to give you a good example of how it bothers me, is I know that one of the ways that they tortured people at Abu Ghraib prison and in Guantanamo was that they forced them to take a shower, cold shower, and then stand out naked in 54-degree temperature. Now that is very, very cold. And every time I take a shower and step out in a cold area, like in the wintertime here, and I feel cold, I think of all those people. And then when you think about how the government um, admitted several years later about Guantanamo, that 80% of the people in Guantanamo were not terrorists, um, you just wonder. Well, I guess I went on a rant there. Next question is, how does the public impact the government? And there's 4 things in the book. They're all listed here: voting, public opinion, interest groups, and direct action. Now, the most obvious one is voting. We think that, wow, we can really affect the government by voting. And we'll talk more about this when we get into the chapter on public opinion and voting. But I would say just right off the bat that voting is pretty much a waste of time. In order for voting to be relevant, you have to have somebody to vote for. And you have to have 2 candidates that really fundamentally differ. And I would strongly argue with you that the differences between the Democrats and the Republicans are almost nothing. All you have to do is go back and look at the policies of President Bush when he was a Republican president for 8 years, and then compare that to the policies of President Obama, who was also in office for 8 years. And what you see is little or no difference between the two. There's a lot of rhetorical difference. There's a lot of Democrats yelling at Republicans and Republicans yelling at Democrats. But I urge you to just look at the policies. What happens in war, what happens on the domestic front in terms of money that's spent for domestic activities, whether that's welfare or roads or whatever, you couldn't tell the difference. You couldn't tell the difference. When I was in the classroom, I referred to President Obama as a black Bush. And what I mean is that there's no fundamental difference between the two. So if voting is going to be relevant, if voting is going to be important in our choices of who we put in office, there has to be fundamental differences between the candidates so that we have a real choice. And at the moment, the way things run, we don't have a choice. There are candidates, like right now, because we're heading to the primaries, you've got 10 or 12 candidates or whatever it is in the Republican side, and on the Democratic side, you've got Barry Sanders in there. But the chances of somebody like a Barry Sanders becoming the Democratic nominee are pretty slim. I think the reason he's running is because he's attempting to affect the Democratic Party. And so that's what he's trying to do, trying to make some changes. But in effect, to make it simple and keep it short, I would just say that the notion of voting is essentially overrated because of the lack of differences between the candidates. The next thing is public opinion, that the individuals or citizens can affect the government by public opinion. And there is a certain amount of truth in that when it comes to like social issues. For example, we've seen in recent years that gays have gained a considerable amount of prestige and rights, like the right to marry, that never existed before. For example, when I was growing up as a kid, there was no outing, and very few people were ever identified as gay, even though there was movie stars and other people like that, famous people, celebrities who were gay. They never really came out as gay. Even somebody like Liberace, who was obviously, demonstrated all the kind of stereotypical concepts of being gay, argued and even went to court in England to deny that he was gay. And then it didn't come out until years later, because in a society it was not acceptable to be gay. But today it is, and part of that is because of public opinion. The public, especially young people, just have not seen any reason to discriminate against gay people the way, say, fundamentalist religious who believe that it's a sin Those kinds of people have stated. So once in a while, when on certain things, the government is affected by public opinion. For the most part, though, because the public doesn't know anything about what's really going on in the government, they're not astute enough to understand the policies and what's happening. Then I would say with the day-to-day activities of government, the public has little or no impact. The third one, which has to do with interest groups, here is where you really impact the government. This is the really most important way. There's a little kind of joke here, and I've heard this a number of different ways. The person saying here, I'm not a NASCAR driver. If you ever see NASCAR drivers, they have advertisement all over their body. He says, I'm a U.S. Senator. And somebody said that one time about politicians, that they ought to all be dressed up like NASCAR drivers because they're being, with the names of their sponsors on their clothes. And there's a lot of truth in that, because politicians take a lot of money from interest groups, especially since the famous Supreme Court decision in which, and maybe we'll get into it later, where the Supreme Court said a few years ago that money is speech and you can't restrict money in campaigns. I find that personally outrageous, but nonetheless, the situation is such that, and this is the fundamental reason why the Democrats and Republicans really don't differ much, is because they both take money from the big interest in the United States. If you look at Hillary Clinton, the leading candidate for the Democratic Party, she'll get as much money or more money from the pharmaceutical companies and the big oil companies and all the companies that are really powerful in the United States. She'll get as much or more, depending on what they consider her chance to win. She'll get as much or more of that money as will any Republican who says he or she, I don't think there's any she's in a Republican list, but any candidate on the Republican side who says they strongly favor business. So that's one of the basic reasons, fundamental, goes right to the heart of American politics as to why the Democrats and the Republicans don't differ. They take money from the same people. But if you really want to influence government, this is the place. This is the one area. We'll talk way more about it later when we're discussing interest groups as a separate topic under inputs in the political system. The last one here is direct action. And direct action is, like demonstrations and boycotts and all of that kind of thing. And that's a way for the public to participate. The problem with that, essentially, is that very few people do it. It may be that you'll see demonstrations going on all the time, but as far as the numbers of people that actually participate in it, if you look at the demos and you look at the demonstrators, most of them happen to be young, no matter what they're demonstrating about, whether it's the environment or women's rights or whatever it is. And so you just don't have very many people doing this kind of action, and I'm not convinced myself that it really does a whole lot of good, because it was associated with the power against the Vietnam War and all of that. But as far as I'm concerned, and I've been in many demos, I'm an animal rights person and have participated in animal rights demonstrations, which are conducted all the time. And I don't know. I think it does psychologically does some good for the people who are holding up the signs, but I'm not sure it does anything to affect public policy. Okay, now we're on question 3. How does the technology change government? And looking at technologies, I'm looking at the ones that were in the book that are mentioned, and you can probably think of other technologies too and how they affect what's going on in the government. A good example that's not here would be the pill and birth control and the abortion pill and all that kind of stuff. That technology that can affect whether women can can have abortions without having to go to a doctor to extract a fetus. But anyway, that's just another thing that's not listed here, and there's so many. But the basic ones that are listed here are the ones in the book, and they include television, computers, internet, cell phones, and electric car. I can't think of anything that's affected the American public, American society, politics more than television. Television brought us the first presidential debates. That's what you see here in the picture of President Kennedy and Nixon in 1960 in the first debate. And that was even black and white television. But television itself, and you see the other picture of a family in the 1950s sitting around watching the television. Television has, it just affects everything, especially if you focus on, you know, if you focus on politics. Political advertising is huge. It's absolutely huge. It can make a candidate who's unknown become known just by putting on a lot of advertising, so people will become familiar with that candidate. Um, the candidates, most of the candidates running on the Republican ticket now are not national candidates. They're not well known nationally. Um, that's probably why Donald Trump gets 27% or the highest number of percentage of any of the Republicans on the list. But given television and the ability of the candidates during the primaries to advertise, they have the money to advertise in key states like Iowa and New Hampshire, they'll get to be known, and they'll most likely pass up Donald Trump easily. The next thing is computers. Um, I think you have to put the two together, computers and the next two together, computers and the internet. Um, yeah, they've really affected society. Uh, Here you see that they're in schools. I know in college, um, it was always a big deal that students have computers and that computer learning be part of the process, even in the classroom. That's how powerful the idea is that computers can help learning. The fact that you're in this class, an internet class where you don't see me, um, and that you're able to get credit just like we were all sitting in a classroom together, even though this is all virtual reality, is testament to the power of the internet and to computers. More and more people are able to gather. The computer is a tremendous vehicle for gathering information. Um, you can get information quickly. It almost makes libraries obsolete. Um, there's just so much about it in terms of information. On the other hand, there's all kinds of other things. There's a negative side. I'm a Buddhist, so I see that there's positives and negatives in everything, even though things that look positive have negatives too. And in the internet and in the computers are the same way. The negative thing is that people, in general, is that people don't relate to people as much anymore. There's all kinds of scary things like computer dating, and even people falling in love. Like, remember that guy who was a football player for I don't remember his name, but he's a football player for Notre Dame, and he says he actually fell in love with somebody he never met, and it wasn't really a woman, it was another guy, just um, putting a picture of a woman up on the internet. And when I think about stuff like that, it just makes me cringe in thinking of how stupid can people be that they would, you know, think of something as important as trying to find a common mate or soulmate or whatever you want to call people who live together, um, by just picking somebody off the internet who may or may not be telling you the truth. It just seems, without being able to look into somebody's eyes, I don't know how you could tell what they're like psychologically. At least that's how I would feel about it. But so there's negatives. There's other negatives too, like pornography and other things that are going on. The use of the internet by terrorists, to tell you how to make a bomb and all that kind of stuff. So there's positives, there's negatives, but we certainly have fallen in love with computers and the internet. And they're, as I used to say in the classroom, technology is our God. Okay, the next one is cell phones. Um, the, Again, positives and negatives when it comes to cell phones and how it impacts the government. I didn't say much about how the government was impacted when it came to computers. I should have said something about that. Um, Essentially, what I would say is that government information, that's the main thing that you could say about it. And you could probably think of other things too. That government information is now available online. If you go to, you need like forms. In the old days, when you needed forms to do your income tax, you had to have the income tax forms. You had to go to the post office and pick them up. And now, of course, that stuff and almost everything else that's governmental is online, so that the government can not have to print all that paper that a lot of people don't use. They'll print way more than when it came to government forms. They would print more tax forms than more than people would use, and then the rest of that paper is just wasted. So you don't have that anymore. You just have people being able to go online and get the information they need, or apply for a job, or all kinds of things. You guys know as well as I do how that works. Cell phones, that's interesting too, because it certainly affects politics in many ways. And of course, I see politics as everywhere and everything. But um, like for example, when I was living in Chicago, they were building some new highway. I don't know if it was, I think it was part of I-80. And what they were doing was they were putting phones in strategic places all along the highway. So you didn't have to go very far, maybe like 4 or 5 miles, and that's it. And then there was a phone, there was like a payphone sitting there. And so if you got an emergency, you could just walk to the nearest phone, and it wasn't far. And it was looked upon at the time as a really good idea. And then the technology advances and everybody has a cell phone. And I mean, do you know anybody who doesn't have a cell phone? So now if there's an emergency, you can just use your cell phone. You can call. And then almost as soon as cell phones became popular, those phones, um, pay phones or whatever they were, I never had to use one, so I don't know if you had to pay or you could just pick it up and tell people you had an emergency. But even in pay phones in those days, you could make an emergency call without money. Um, so they just took them out because it was irrelevant due to the technology, and that certainly saved the government a lot of money. Um, the other thing I always think about when I think about cell phones is the camera on the cell phone. And what happened when President Kennedy was shot in 1962, when President Kennedy was shot, um, there was only the Zapruder film. There was one guy in that whole um, parade of people watching the motorcade that had a movie camera that was in a strategic position to take pictures of the president as he was shot. Now, if that were to take place today, there would be all kinds of people with cameras everywhere, and in every position, and there would be a million videos of that incident, and we wouldn't be sitting around all these years later talking about was there or was there not a conspiracy? Did Lee Harvey Oswald act by himself, or did he have help? And we would know. We would know. And so that and social media and everything else that goes with the internet, computers and cell phones, all really affect in a positive way what people can know and what people can do. On the negative side, I would say is what this picture shows is that anytime you go in a place like Starbucks, you can see all these people on their media, on a phone or on a computer or some other device, and And I'm not saying that's bad. I'm not saying it's bad that, people have iPads and cell phones and that they're able to access the internet. What I'm saying is that it's doing a lot to damage social relationships, that people really talk to each other anymore. I mean, when you think of a cafe and coffee back in the 1920s or 30s or all the way up until cell phones, it meant people sat around and talked to each other and looked at each other and had these discussions. And nowadays, people are texting or doing something else on the internet or whatever, and not paying any attention to the people immediately around them. So the last one in this category is electric cars, and that was mentioned in the book. And I won't go into much on this, but I would just say that if we ever got anywhere with the battery car or solar cars or alternative fuels, biofuels, or whatever they're called, if we ever did that, as mechanisms to replace fossil fuel, um, gasoline, we would revolutionize the whole way we operate in the United States, and it would certainly make a big difference in the way people, um, or companies anyway, the way companies operate, especially environmentally. Um, Climate change and the pollution of the environment is really devastating. You people probably don't notice it as much because you live in the Chicago area, but I live in Santa Fe, New Mexico, and I just visited Chicago um, a couple of weeks ago, and um, it's incredible that I lived there all my adult life. I live near O'Hare Field, and the noise, the heavy air pollution, um, it's just unbelievable to see it from a perspective of somebody who spent the last 2 years in Santa Fe, New Mexico, where it's perfectly clean air, and you could see for miles and miles as you stand up here in the mountains. So we really got to do something. This is terrible. And I never really thought as much about it. As a matter of fact, in my classrooms, I used to kid, I never trust any air I can't see. But it was really scary. So hopefully we'll get somewhere with this electric car and we'll change things. Okay, this is the last one. Social changes and how they influence government. And the ones that are listed are the ones that are in the book. Multiculturalism, zero population growth among white population. That might have come from me, but that's the basis of multiculturalism. In other words, that the white population is diminishing. That's been the dominant um, number of majority of people in the United States from the beginning have been Anglo-Saxon white, and now due to a kind of no growth population among white people, the multiculturalism or other cultural groups are becoming more important, like Hispanics in the United States. Um, Another thing, social change, would be expansion of the life cycle. You've got a lot more older people. And then the last one is the lack of jobs in the United States. So if we talk about multiculturalism, it's probably enough to say that there are many different kinds of people in the United States now. It isn't just, for example, with religion, it isn't just Protestant, Catholics, and Jews. Um, and concerned about the well-being of Protestants first and foremost because they're the majority, and then maybe Catholics, and then thirdly Jews. Um, Now it's multicultural, and you have people of the Islamic faith, and you have Buddhists, and you have people coming from the Hindus and all kinds of people coming to the United States and are becoming relevant. I should say becoming relevant in the United States. Um, Native Americans included in all that, becoming relevant, meaning becoming politically relevant in the sense that we begin to care about what they think and about how they operate. American Indian's a good example. Um, I've been a football fan since I was a little kid because my family were always watching football, especially my father. And the Washington team is known as the Redskins. Well, that that logo, that mascot, that concept was never even cared about when I was a kid. And then all of a sudden, in our time, because American Indians have become more conscious in the American psyche, uh, essentially what we're recognizing is that that's an insult to Native Americans, and that that name needs to be changed. Now the Washington team, especially with its owner, I believe he's an older guy, is playing real hardball and it doesn't want to get rid of it. But almost everybody else in the society recognizes that it's time for it to go. So multiculturalism affects the government in a way that it makes it sensitive to other than the traditional groups in the society. White Anglo-Saxon Protestant was the main majority, and it was their views and that really are reflected in the law. Like, for example, one of the classic examples of what you have is a recognition of holy days and holidays by the government that reflect the major religions. Like, for example, Christmas. Christmas reflecting the major religions rather than, what about, if you have something like Christmas, what about the Jews? Now you have to start to consider, what about the Jews? What about the Buddhists? What about the Hindus and so on, who aren't believers in Jesus? So the government has to begin to take that into consideration, and it does. And maybe at some point we'll talk more about it. The next thing is the expansion of older people. You can see that from the chart here. Um, not older people, but race by race, and you can see that basically you've got the increases here in, I should say the decrease, if you look down here, the decrease that's anticipated among white people. 81% non-Hispanic whites going down from 81 to 61%. The black population not rising too much, going from 9 to 12, and so on. Up here, the Hispanic, big change here. Hispanic going from 6 to 18%. So you can see that there's a change, and what that's going to mean for the government is that the government's going to have to pay more attention to Hispanics. This kind of like English only kind of stuff is all going to go out the window. Candidates are going to have to know how to speak Spanish, at least to some degree. And more importantly, the issues affecting Hispanics are going to have to be addressed. So that's the kind of thing that happens as the population shifts, as more people, especially as more people become voters, because right now Hispanics are not really demonstrating the effect of their numbers in the population because a lot of them don't vote. As they, generations increase in education and as they begin to vote more often, the end result will be that they'll have more power. They'll have more political power. Here's a picture on old people, and what's happening is, and this has a tremendous effect on government, is that people are living longer. Now the quality of life is lousy in America, but it's for old people. It's lousy. And people are, all you got to do is go to some old folks' home or something like that, and you can see that, people are. It's a waiting place to die. Even places where you spend a lot of money is still basically just warehousing these people. There's nothing for them to do. They're being warehoused until they die. And the thing that affects the government is that these older people spend a lot of money on medical care. Most medical care in the United States is going to the elderly. And the medical system, to make a long story short about the medical system, because I don't want to make this lecture too long, the basic thing about the medical system is it doesn't work. And maybe as we go along, I'll talk more about it, why the medical system in the United States doesn't work. But all it does is have a tendency to prolong life, not the quality of life. And then a lot of that is people's own fault because we eat all the wrong food and we don't exercise and we don't do what we're supposed to do. So, all the blame doesn't go to doctors, but at the same time, the medical system is so expensive. And if the government's going to pay for not only Medicare, Social Security, I was going to say not only Social Security, but Medicare, um, it just becomes more and more difficult because of medical cost. It's not uncommon now, for example, to go to the drugstore. I won't say grocery store. Go to the drugstore and get medications that cost you more than $100. It's insane. The last one is job perspective and what's going on in the United States. And it's kind of hard to put this in a visual, but essentially what I would just say is that we tend to be losing jobs. Every time we make these agreements to, to allow other countries free access to the United States borders, where we don't have tariffs on what they're selling, and that's what all these trade agreements are all about. That they get to freely move about, and businesses, of course, get to move out of the United States and take the jobs with them. The end result is that the United States is losing jobs, and we're losing jobs at all levels. In the beginning, they used to talk about it just as like manufacturing jobs, meaning people with essentially people with little or no skills, semi-skilled workers or no-skilled workers, um, were unable to find jobs now. But it's gotten much bigger than that because of computers, because of the internet, because of the the fact that the world is shrinking. Many different kinds of businesses are able to farm out the workers. For example, um, I use Dell computers, and Dell support is mainly, except for business support, is in India or some other foreign country. So all of those jobs that would have gone to computer people in the United States are farmed out to foreign countries. So that's just like one small example. But what it says is that even people with an education are not guaranteed that they're going to have a job in the United States anymore. Um, and that problem has gotten worse, and it probably will continue to get worse unless we do something about it. And the main thing that we need to do about it is to require businesses to live up to standards like they have in the United States in these other countries.